Wes. How are you?
Hi, Caro. I'm good. Thank you.
Thank you for being here. I'm really excited for be here and sharing time with you. And thank you so much for take the trip and going and be here in Medellin with us, all the team and the community of Python Colombia.
Yeah, you're welcome. Yeah, I mean, I've always wanted to go to Colombia and to Medellin in particular. So it's nice to be here. So getting to know the city a little bit, and it's nice to meet people in the community here. And it's great to see how big the conference has grown over the last few years. So congratulations on all the work organizing and building the community.
Thank you so much. So many people admire your work from pandas to all that you do with open software, open source software. You are a kind of Python hero for us. So let's start with talking about pandas, of course. During your keynote, you share with us a timeline, how it's growing over the time, because it's really huge, the code bases, the documentation, the user bases, and everything related. At this point of the timeline, how do you think the community can help?
Well, I think Pandas has definitely become like very much a community project, and as I mentioned in my talk, and a lot of people don't know that about 7 years ago I stepped away from day-to-day maintenance and a lot of the community development in Pandas. In part because I got busy with starting the company, and I felt, given that I had spent 5 years on the project, it was a good time to allow other people to step into a leadership role and to take to do more for Pandas. But I think often in these projects, Pandas is not the only example, but sometimes people are always looking at like, oh, the person that created the project, or maybe the maintainers, like the core developers of the project. But Pandas has had around 2,000 unique contributors, so the contributions from the long tail of all of the improvements that so many people have made to the project, when you add them all up, are extremely valuable. And obviously, you need the maintainers and the core developers to provide guidance and to help new contributors, to review pull requests, and to do kind of they're the glue that hold the project together. But the community is really important. And so one great example of how the community came together was in the beginning of 2018. Pandas had a worldwide documentation sprint where there were people getting together in person and working on improving the documentation for Pandas. And I think there were just a ton of pull requests that were sent on GitHub to make improvements to the documentation, because often documentation is one of the parts of open source projects that gets the least amount of effort. But when you consider making a project successful and accessible to new people, the documentation is one of the most important things.
Yeah.
And so really we should all spend a lot more time writing documentation.
Well, thank you very much. I have another question about your experience developing open source software. So you have been working on that for a while. What would you tell to the developers who don't know exactly how to start or contribute to their favorite open source projects?
Yeah, I mean, so I think the important thing is to find a project that you're interested in and is valuable to you in your work or your life in some way.
Okay.
And maybe there's many ways to get involved. So sometimes it might mean looking at the issue tracker and finding some projects will mark new issues or issues that are good for new contributors, to try to help new contributors get involved in the project. The issue tracker can be pretty overwhelming, so I would say to not hesitate or not feel bad about asking on the mailing list or asking on GitHub for advice about where to start.
Okay.
Like if you go to the Pandas issue tracker, you'll see that there's over 1,000 open issues, maybe over 2,000 open issues, and so it can be really overwhelming to say like, I just, which one of these 2,000 issues do I pick? And in general, I find that contributor communities and maintainers are welcoming, and if if maintainers or if the community is not being welcoming, that's also good feedback to say, hey, like I really wanted to get involved in this project and I didn't, I was trying to get help and I couldn't find anyone to help me. I think that's very good feedback for a project. And so I think nowadays, like projects, since many projects want to grow their communities and to make them make them larger and more diverse, and so to create that kind of welcoming environment where it takes a while to find your sea legs, as we might say. It's like you've never contributed to this project before, and to contribute your first pull request can seem like just a huge, like a big deal. And so it's been fun to see, like when people contribute their first pandas pull request, it's like a huge source of pride for them that it's like, oh, my first contribution to an open source project. And
that's really nice.
I think it's the job of the maintainers to help with that process and to get people involved. And so sometimes people might only submit one pull request, or maybe you might become an active contributor, and even people that go around in a project fixing typos and like misspellings in the documentation, like that's very useful too.
Yeah.
So I think there's really no contribution too small. And I will say that there's plenty of ways to contribute to open source projects outside of code itself. I think sometimes people feel like the code and like the pull requests are the only things that matter. And I think all of the work of talking to other contributors, like having discussions on issues, like if you find issues that are about something that it's a problem or something you run into or some way that you want to make the project better, just sharing your experience, or like saying like, oh, I've also wanted this, or this has been a problem for me, like sharing your feedback with the project is very useful. Some other ways to help are to I think community organizing, so helping with meetups and recruiting either yourself or your colleagues to speak at community events, just working to get people more engaged in the community. That's also very helpful. And so I think there's plenty of people that I've seen, like I mentioned in my talk, like Mark Garcia and the Pandas core developers has done a ton of work in community development and kind of working on organizing meetups and getting like the documentation sprint was one of his big things. And so hugely valuable, that kind of work. And so it's not all about the lines of code that you contribute.
It looks like we need communication. The communication is the key. Don't be afraid to ask in the GitHub and ask for the maintainers and ask for anything that the people could need. Can you tell us how do you get involved in early stage to open source software development? And also, what would you recommend when a contributor is experiencing burnout?
Yeah, so for me, I've been working on Pandas as a closed source project for about a year, and this was in 2009, and I started talking to my colleagues and to my boss and management at the company AQR where I was working, and said, this Pandas project, I can't remember if it was called Pandas at that point. I think we hadn't chosen a name, but it's like, this seems very useful. It doesn't seem like there's a project like this in open source, and this is an opportunity to make a big contribution to the open source world, and maybe people will contribute to it. And so I got interested in open source around that time. And it took a while to get them to agree to let me open source the project, but I was allowed to put the project on Google Code in the second half of 2009. And but at that point I really didn't know anything about open source communities or community development. That all happened later. So for a while it was just kind of my side project, and I worked on it in my free time, and I worked on it at work, and I left AQR, and I was a grad student at Duke for about a year, and so AQR was paying me as a consultant to work on add some features to Pandas during that time. But that was kind of, it was a very quiet beginning. But my first conference talk was at PyCon 2010, and then I started going to the SciPy conferences in the United States, and that's where I began to meet people like Fernando Perez and John Hunter and Travis Oliphant, and like the really key people in the Python scientific community. And they were actually the ones who they were excited about what I was doing, and they were really encouraging to do more open source, and so they were a valuable resource to me in terms of navigating like the community dynamics and the occasional politics of of open source as I started to do more there.
Gotcha. And the second, another topic.
So I guess we can talk about burnout.
The burnout,
Yeah, so I think burnout comes, burnout it's even hard to define. It's almost like a form of depression that happens in people that work too hard on something, or maybe like they get too emotionally invested in a project, and they overwork themselves, or they go through a series of disappointments, or but really I think it comes from trying to do more than you're actually capable of, and not taking enough time to take care of yourself and to manage your stress levels, to take enough time for yourself and spend time with friends and your hobbies and things like that. But I think also open source by its nature can be really overwhelming. So like it's almost it's become almost like a joke at this point. Like the more successful your open source project is, the more overwhelmed you feel, because as things get more successful, you get a lot more bug reports and a lot more people complaining about the project. And it seems like you only really, as a maintainer, you usually are only hearing when things are going poorly, because people come to you when there's a problem. But when things are going well, like you might see like positive tweets, or maybe you'll see people talking at conferences, but the feedback that you get in open source is very one-sided, and it's mostly negative. And so I think when you're confronted with this like stream of negative information, like you're only hearing about the problems in the project, after a period of months or years, that can get very exhausting. So I think as far as dealing with that, I think I guess what I recommend to people is that they make sure to take care of themselves, and it's like if you need to take some time away from the project, or you need to have a period where you're less maybe you leave more of the work to other people. I think particularly people who really get invested in a project, and I'm the same way, is it's easy to feel like the project is a part of your identity, and so you feel like, oh, if there's bugs, like if I don't fix these bugs, or if I don't address these user concerns, then the project is going to fail, and all of this time and work that I've invested in the project is going to be wasted. But I would say that's not a good way to look at things. Like generally, if you're working on something that's important and that people care about, if you personally need to take a break, or to kind of have more of a balance, or leave more work to other people, it's okay, and the project will be okay. 99% of the time. But I think to not feel like I think sometimes when people get burned out, it's because they just feel like they can't stop fixing bugs, like they can't stop of being a part of the daily grind, or the project is going to fail. And so just changing the way that you feel about the project, and trusting that when you make space for other people to take more responsibility and to take more of a role in the project, more often than not, people will take the space. Like if you give them a chance to take more ownership of part of the project, they will, and that's a good lesson for maintainers to learn.
Wonderful. Well, I want to ask you this in Spanish. Acabaste de decir hobbies. ¿Cuál es tu hobby favorito y qué haces cuando no estás frente al computador?
Bueno, mis hobbies favoritos. Bueno, no me queda mucho tiempo libre fuera del trabajo, pero bueno, tengo una vida bastante sencilla. Me gusta cocinar y me gusta correr y hacer yoga. Se hace yoga aquí en
Genial.
Colombia. ¿Y qué más? Leer libros y un poco de videojuegos, como casi todos la gente técnica.
Sí,
Y me gusta viajar y claro, estudiar idiomas.
me encanta.
¿Qué más? No hay
Eso es.
nada especial.
Oh, eres muy especial. Okay, let's back to the English. Regarding data science field, why the infrastructure is so important? What would you like to say is the most important metric concerning infrastructure?
Um, well, infrastructure is difficult because it's the software that everyone depends on. But people want the infrastructure to be good, for it to be high quality, to have good performance, to not have bugs. But in general, it seems that most developers want to work on applications and to be as close as possible to solving the business problems, to solving
Yeah.
to kind of as close as possible to the end users. Whereas, data in Python, one of the most important long-term infrastructure projects has been NumPy, and so getting people to develop NumPy is always difficult, not only because the project has a lot of C code, so you need to be able to program in C, but it's just in general very low level, and so a lot of people are not attracted to that low level work. But the benefit of the infrastructure projects is that if you build something in infrastructure projects, then everyone benefits. And so if you identify these common pieces that everyone needs, then the development there has a lot of value. Not only does it benefit a lot of projects, but it benefits a lot of projects, and the code will also have a long lifetime. So you build something and then it gets used for 10 or 20 years after that in some cases. But in general, open source infrastructure suffers from a tragedy of the commons, because it's everyone's problem, but yet no one's problem. And so there ends up being like a very small number of people who are supporting, kind of holding up like just so many other projects. And as time has gone on, I mean, I've gotten more interested in infrastructure projects because of my own experience building pandas. But recruiting open source developers to collaborate on infrastructure projects and spend their time on them is just very difficult.
Yeah, it's really hard. Okay, as part of the community, we are so grateful for have you been giving up through libraries, talks, discussions, or these interviews. The past 5 years, you have been working on a new project, Apache Arrow. Can you tell us more about it?
Yeah, so the Arrow project arose. I see it essentially as a continuation of work that I started in pandas. So if you think about the pandas project, we had to solve all of these problems in order to make pandas work. So we have to be able to parse CSV files, and we have to be able to run all of the group by operations and all of the different built-in operations in pandas. So pandas has grown a huge amount of custom data processing code to make all of its algorithms work and have good performance. But the downside of that is that the pandas community and the pandas maintainers have this extremely big code base that they're responsible for, and that doesn't have a very much opportunity for code reuse with other projects. And I found, in talking with other developers, like I talked with people in the R community, that people in the R community are solving the exact same problems, but they're solving them for R data frames.
Yeah.
And so beginning to look at, well, why is it so difficult to have shared libraries of algorithms? That's one problem that was motivating to me. Another problem was the issue of how to move data from one runtime environment to another. So like from a database system to Python, that was an interesting problem. Or move data from Python and pandas into, let's say, a big data system or into something like Apache Spark. And so the technical details of how you relocate a gigabyte of data from one runtime to another, there's very little, I mean, there is off-the-shelf technology for that, but it often features a lot of serialization overhead, so a lot of computational work to convert from one data format to another. So the Arrow project was designed to address both of these problem areas. So first is to have kind of a universal data frame format, so that is not language dependent. So it could be used in Java, it can be used in Python, C++, R,
Whatever.
JavaScript. You know, we have people doing things in Rust and Go. And the data, regardless of which programming language you're in, the way that the data is arranged in your computer in RAM is exactly the same. And so that concept is very powerful. So we're building libraries for all these different programming languages, and we're building libraries of algorithms to process this universal data frame format. And then we've got bindings that we're building in Python and R so that it can actually be used by developers in these ecosystems. So my goal with the project is to build basically a computational foundation for data frame type problems that we can use for the next 20 or 30 years. And that also helps to kind of tie the room together, to bring together developers from these different programming language communities which are solving the exact same problems, but delivering their solutions to different kinds of programmers. So it's kind of, the way I think about it is like, there's often a lot of talk about language wars, like which is better, Python or R, and it was a bit sad to me that there weren't just very many ways for R and Python programmers to collaborate. And so what I really wanted to do was to help create an environment where people are able to collaborate and build some useful things that benefit their communities.
Wonderful. Well, Wes, thank you so much. This was a really pleasure for me to be with you. And something else that you want to share with us?
I don't think so.
No?
So
Okay.
yeah, thanks for having me, and thanks for the interview.
Thank you.